regardless of what you think of them, they are, as one friend of mine said, most of them would even be qualified to be law clerks.
Touche.
Uh,
Are you back on? Just hold on.
this is off the record anyway. One thing that is, John Stevens was a fraternity brother of mine in college, and was once, I've lost touch with him. He was one of my best friends at one time. And it's bothered me to see him and Rehnquist flying off at one another. And I've written to both of them saying that I hoped that they had good personal relationships, but I never got an answer.
Okay.
I don't know.
By all accounts, but I don't have any particular inside sources, these nine do get along, despite their divisions and sometimes sharp tones in the opinions. It's a compatible collegial group. And obviously Stevens and Rehnquist have been together for a long time. So.
Yeah.
You have conversations with Chief Justice Rehnquist? Does he write back? Did you?
Oh, very occasionally.
Right. Yeah. Sounds crazy, but does he like what he's doing? This sounds like a really stupid question, but here he is. He's been
Not
at it for
all
31
that
years.
much.
Yeah.
You know, he was talking about 10 years ago. He was talking about retiring. He wanted to become as I put it, he wanted to become a Raymond Aron. Now, Raymond Aron is a French journalist who is just head and shoulders above everybody else. And whenever he says anything, anybody drops. And he wanted to become a Raymond Aron.
Oh, but he's so much more than a journalist.
He is now. Oh, Aron, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Aron, yeah.
Right.
As you reflect back on this 1 year of being part of the world of Justice Jackson, what was the legacy to you? I mean, what was your walk away from that experience, saying, because of I worked for Justice Jackson 1 year at the Supreme Court, here's what I learned about me and maybe what you learned about Justice Jackson?
Well, I developed a great deal of intellectual capital working with Jackson and Rehnquist, which I'm afraid I have which I have wasted.
Mm-hmm.
I've followed lines of activity where it hasn't been all that helpful to me. Well, I've often regretted that I didn't stay and stick it out in the United States. But it certainly was the most interesting year of my life. Now, that perhaps doesn't mean much coming from me, but I heard exactly the same thing said by Abner Mikva, who had served as a judge on the Court of Appeals and as special counsel of the President of the United States. And he still said that the best year of his life was when he was a law clerk.
Mm-hmm.
So
What will be Justice Jackson's legacy?
I'm afraid it'll be underestimated. He is, among lawyers, he will certainly be remembered because of the remarkable stuff that he wrote. But not as anybody who, Nuremberg, there. That surely will be. What's going to happen to the Nuremberg legacy and the way the world is going now is another problem. I'd like to believe that when we go through our current messes, we will come back and see how very wise Nuremberg was. But at least, but I think that he will not get the reputation that he deserves as a Supreme Court justice. I'm sorry to say that, because I think I sent John or I said to you, I guess it was this note of Judge Posner, that there have been three great American justices. There have been Cardozo, Learned Hand, and Jackson. But for some strange reason, he's just, well, I guess people will think of him more often than they will think of Murphy. But
Is that the same reason, this may be a question for John, frankly, is that the same reason why it's been very difficult to have a biography of note to date, that he's been hard to categorize,
I don't know.
catalog?
I really don't know the answer to that question. I can't imagine why it was that Phil Kurland dropped the ball. I know that when he dropped it, I wrote a letter to Bill Rehnquist thinking that he might know. And he said that he did not know, but he thought that what Kurland had done was reprehensible. Because he had got quite a long way away. Maybe he found that Jackson in his personal life had some feet of clay that he didn't want to talk about. That's the only, because who doesn't?
Right, and particularly at the time Kurland was doing his work, that may have been a paralyzing kind of problem. A little bit more distance might allow one to have a different perspective.
And of course, Kurland had taken on a hell of a lot of work too. He was
Yes.
he was the dean of the law school. He was doing that Supreme Court reporter.
Right.
He was he was teaching full time. He would have been the
He got
ideal
pulled up
man.
into university administration. I
yeah.
think he was the provost.
Actually, I think it was Bill Jackson who selected him to do
Yes.
the biography.
Well,
And-
Felix and Bill Jackson, and
uh-huh.
yeah, and I think Bill Jackson was furious that Kurland didn't deliver.
Then the sequence, Kurland's papers are where? No.
Well, Jackson's Supreme Court chambers went to Kurland, and they were in his basement in Hyde Park for 20 plus years, and they went back to the library.
Well, Kurland did do some work. He didn't just.
He wrote a beautiful essay that's about 100 pages. It's the biographical portrait of Jackson in the Lives of the Justices series that's edited by Friedman and Israel.
Mhm.
And he wrote a number of pieces that are clearly based in his Jackson work. But he did not leave a manuscript or any developed drafting. He seems to have gathered much more than he wrote, is my
He
sense.
passed away?
Yes. Yeah, he died in the last 10 years, maybe the last 5 years.
Is that when Murray picked it up, or did he do it separately?
Approximately in the same time period. It's not that Murray was commissioned or that it was a handoff, but Murray's getting started and Phil Kurland's declaring defeat. Yeah.
You're there for a year. What's the highlight of that 1 year of Donald Cronson's stay in Washington? Reflect back either from a decision you had, or maybe a couple decisions that you were part of.
I really can't say.
Yeah,
The whole year was a very fascinating year.
right.
And was a year I made one big mistake. I got married to the wrong woman, which is probably the reason why I didn't go along the career path that I should have. But I've launched a divorce and I'm now married to the right woman, so things worked out
That's important.
all right. You didn't meet Jill though, did you?
No,
when
I
you
didn't
came?
meet her. No.
Well, we'll have to arrange
And
that.
actually, the wrong woman, if I can just pick up your phrase, I obviously don't know her, is the person who I first tracked
Yeah.
down in New York.
Well, she
who
and
gave
I
me
are now
your phone
she and
number.
I are now friends because she got to be a good friend of my present wife.
Okay,
So
okay. No, I'd like to meet Jill at some point. That'd be lovely.
I have
Steve,
a
you-
question for you. Since you worked both with Justice Jackson and with now Chief Justice Rehnquist, do you ever have any thoughts about, and in a way sort of Jackson was the great intellect of the New Deal court, and the Rehnquist court has sort of been I won't say repudiation, but a bend back.
I don't think that's the right word either. No.
Well, okay, I agree. It's not the right word.
And if it's, again, it has been said to be,
turn away from.
it has
maybe.
been said to be perhaps a repudiation of the Warren Court, because it was in the Warren Court that things did start to get just a little bit haywire. Then, of course, Jackson was gone by.
Just as a hypothetical exercise, what do you think Robert Jackson would have been if he'd lived to be a member of the Warren Court?
He would have been a dissenter.
Okay. Do you think Harlan is a fair proxy for what Jackson, his
Yeah.
successor
Yeah.
is largely what Jackson?
The original Harlan, not the one, John Marshall Harlan, the one who was there in the 19th century.
No,
Yes.
I mean the one who succeeded Robert Jackson, John
Oh.
Marshall Harlan the
The
second.
second.
Do you think he was a proxy for what Jackson would have been if Jackson had lived the next 10 years?
Well, I think they would have been pretty close, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You think Jackson might have had more persuasive power with Earl Warren, and he might have developed differently than he
That's
did?
an interesting thought, which I should have thought of that before. But he was a very persuasive man, and I think it just might be. And he had all that baggage with him too.
Right, they had a relationship.
Yeah, yeah. 'Cause Warren was not a very good lawyer, and Jackson was a superb lawyer, and maybe being a good lawyer has some advantages on the Supreme Court.
Right. But maybe Jackson wasn't much of a politician, and maybe Warren was a superb politician.
Yeah, that's right.
And then it comes to, obviously, the question of what the Supreme Court is supposed to be, law or politics or some hybrid.
Well, that probably is indeed the reason why Jackson will be underrated in the future, just because he wasn't much of a politician. He was particularly disgusted with Douglas's forays into the political area. He said, when a man gets to this court, he should be happy to just not have any further ambitions. And certainly Jackson had no further ambitions when he got to that court.
Well, what about the Chief Justice-ship? Do you think that was a sore spot?
I'm sure it was. And of course, when Vincent was appointed the Chief
Yes,
Justice,
right.
it should have been Jackson. And Vincent, why, do you know the story? Why was it Vincent appointed?
Well, I think Truman was persuaded to change his mind. And once he was persuaded not to give it to Jackson, he
Of course, Vincent was an old buddy of
had an old
his.
buddy. off the
And
court.
Truman certainly was no lawyer. And but Vincent was pretty much of a disaster. Vincent had one important function on the Supreme Court, and that is that he persuaded everybody that he was an expert on taxes, because he had been on the House Ways and Means Committee. And he had a law clerk who had been a professor of tax law at University of Indiana. So he at least was. So there was a tendency on the part of the members of the court to just go along with what Jackson did, with what Vincent did on tax cases. And Arrowsmith was one example of that. It was actually Black that wrote the opinion, but it was Vincent who sat down and worked it all out. But he in fact didn't know very much about tax law either. He was.
There's a quote that is attributed to Justice Jackson talking about 1953, the Vincent Court, and he says, "This court, the Vincent Court, no longer respects impersonal rules of law, but is guided in these matters by personal impressions, which from time to time may be shared by a majority of the justices."
Is that Brown against Allen? That's what it sounds
It
like.
could be, don't know. It was
It sounds like Brown against Allen, which he did an enormous amount of work, and Rehnquist did an enormous
Right.
amount of work on that one too. But it does sound like Jackson.
What about some of the other personalities on the court? The Burtons, the Mintons. Was there any sense of...
Well, Jackson got along with all of them. He did not have a very high opinion of any of them as lawyers. But as I say, before, the amazing thing was that he got so close to Black.
Right.
'Cause
And
they,
Black-
they had been bitter enemies a few years before.
And Black would come through into the chambers. He'd come through your
Often,
clerk's room.
yeah.
He was adjacent.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Black had a very pretty secretary. I remember
Oh, was that
too.
Elizabeth, who became his second wife?
I can't remember. I can't remember her name, but she was very pretty.
So as far as academic equals, in the category, would he put Black, would he put Frankfurter?
Frankfurter, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would he put Black in that category? Is it academic? No.
No. No, Black was very practical.
Right.
And Black was quite much more dependent on his law clerks than Black, Murphy, Douglas. They were all law clerk judges.
Harry Truman. Did Jackson ever
We never talked about it.
talk about the president? Or I guess
Never talked
he
about
left
it.
office during your. Okay.
No.
Greg, do you have other?
This has been just terrific.
Well, I'm very sorry that I couldn't do this 30 years ago. I think I would have
This is
been.
marvelous.
Have we forgotten anything that we should have asked, or any story that?
Well, I told you also, again, a few details about the Aerosmith case,
Okay.
which was interesting. This was the tax case I told you about
Right.
where he dissented. And during the course of the discussion of the Aerosmith case, he told me about his experience in prosecuting Paul Mellon, which is how he made his name in Washington and successfully prosecuting the Mellon case. But he told me that he did go to the trouble of checking many years later, and he figured out that if he had lost the Mellon case, in the long run, the government would have realized more money than it did as a result of his having won. And that maybe was behind his phrase in Aerosmith about the invisible boomerangs.
Right. I love the phrase.
Yeah.
Quite that interesting. Huh. What would have been the theory behind that? If he'd have lost,
I did not cross-examine him, I just took his word for it.
Mellon involves so many complicated issues. I assume one of the deductibility principles that the case established, in the end, became something that taxpayers and their counsel learned to navigate and cost the Treasury
right.
a stream of revenue. That's-
There's no question that the government would have won an awful lot more money if Aerosmith had gone the other way.
Right. Right.
Because even in my own individual practice, I've had occasion to use that
Okay.
loophole.
Let's talk about your life after clerkship. You decide, were you asked to go for another year? Or did you just
No.
because that was just 1 year and
No, and he had, when Bill and I left, he had just one clerk to replace the two of us. That was Barry. And he had before
right.
operated with a single clerk, and he just decided after a couple of years that this was the way to do it. And Barrett.
And recite the story, I think, how you and Barrett had a chance to meet each other, I mean, at the courthouse.
Oh, no. He came in and introduced himself because he was going to be taking my place
Right.
and talk about the files and so forth. The name, his father was a very well-known judge, and so the name was quite familiar to me.
Right.
And
Then after this, you take off for, was it Cravath?
yeah,
And how long you were there for Cravath?
I was there for 8 years.
But you could connect it with Mobile after that. Was that a client of Cravath's?
No. At the crucial stage when I was at Cravath, I had an accident which caused me to lose most of the sight of one of my eyes. So I got, and it took me a while to learn to read with just one eye. So I was sort of out of things for a few months. And it's such a competitive rat race that so many people started going ahead of where I had been, that I decided to take a year off and learn German, which I didn't know. I knew French, but I didn't know German. And I had a good friend who was a lawyer in Zurich who gave me the opportunity to come over and work in his office for a year. And then I happened. Life is lovely in Switzerland. It's a lovely place to live. It's not a very interesting place for a lawyer professionally, but the life there, lifestyle is marvelous. And at the end of the year, I decided to stay for a little while longer, and then that's how I got Mobile. Mobile found out I was there, and they called me up and they started using me for a couple of things, and then they swallowed me, and I became a full-time employee, house counsel of Mobile, first in Geneva, and then in London. Then, after I had been in London for all the time I was in London, I was divorced, and I kept a flat in Gstaad in the mountains in Switzerland and spent my weekends there. Kept some touch with Switzerland. After I had been in London for, I think, 9 years, I got myself into a serious British tax problem. And that's I won't explain it, it's very complicated, but it would have meant that if I had continued to stay with Mobile, they were going to send me to Paris or back to New York or someplace, but I'd have to leave. And it was at that time that the opportunity came to set up, really, the Credit Suisse First Boston Group in Geneva. So I jumped there. I made a deal with them that I could also practice as an individual lawyer on the side. And as time went on, I did more and more of my own practice and less of the CSFB practice. Finally, toward the end, I was a director of a couple of their companies, and then they moved everybody to London. I didn't want to move in London, I just stayed in Geneva. So I then stayed in Geneva, again doing mainly as a private lawyer, but I also then took on as a client J.P. Morgan, and for a while I was devoting about half of my time to J.P. Morgan. Then 15 years ago, I was very seriously ill and almost died and had to give up practice entirely. And after a year or so in the hospital, I came out again and I started again. But now I do a very limited practice. I give advice on U.S. law, mainly Swiss law, and mainly tax law and trust law to Swiss banks, few Swiss companies, few wealthy individuals. But it's not very active, and I spent 4 months a year away, at least 4 months a year. For many years, we did it in South Africa. And now my wife got a little tired of South Africa for the last 2 years. We always have gone to Florida in the fall for a month. But now we just decided to go to Florida and stay there for the fall and the whole winter. And believe it or not, I still have a few clients, but damn few.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And your children I know there's somebody in New York, right?
I have a son who is an investment banker, and Jill has 3 children, all of whom live in Switzerland.
Okay.
And she has a whole lot of grandchildren.
Okay.
I have 1 grandchild.
That's wonderful.
This has been wonderful.
Well, I just want to say I enjoy it. I think it's marvelous that you have done this. I regret, again, it's too bad that you weren't there 30 years ago, because it could have been done so. But then, of course, we wouldn't have had John 30 years ago, so
No,
maybe
I
it's
mean,
just as well.
Right, I'll take the lucky break, I guess. And legacy is a funny thing. You know, it might take something like 50 years of distance to sort of separate a Jackson from the pack, or to appreciate a Nuremberg among different legal achievements.
Yeah. Well, I do hope that the Nuremberg will be the first of many to follow.
Well, Chief Justice Rehnquist, when he came here in May, and of course he could speak on any subject he wanted. He's the Chief Justice. But clearly to him, the legacy of Justice Jackson is Nuremberg.
That's what Jackson always said himself.
And he went on to that great detail about that.
And there probably was nobody who was as well qualified to do it. He did read a great deal about the Second World War, which is a fascinating thing to read about, and all of the terrible things that happened under Hitler and under Stalin. And, 50 years from now, people will not believe that things like that could have happened.
Well, it's not even 50 years from now. I was talking to someone in a bar last night who was trying to convince me how wonderful Stalin was and how people had lots of freedom under his government. It's like, I don't know where you figured that one out from.
Well, just before I left Switzerland, I was reading a book about Stalin, and I got one of the many fascinating facts about Stalin. In the winter of 41 and 42, when all was almost lost, when the Russians were on the outskirts of Moscow, or the Germans were on the outskirts of Moscow, when they had cut off Leningrad, Stalin killed 140,000 of his own soldiers. Because his strategy was, if you lose a battle, you get a regiment and kill it. The theory being that the remaining regiments would decide they'll fight better, but they didn't. But finally, he killed 140,000 people before he realized that this was not going to help him. But he had a mania. He just seemed to think you could solve any problem by killing enough people.
You know, all of his major combat commanders were under suspended sentence of death. I mean, I think pretty much every one of them. I mean,
Well, his really best commanders were killed. Tukhachevsky was killed before the war started. And some of them were actually called out of Lubyanka and sent up to the front.
Oh, yeah, that's what I mean, yeah. And there was one who had all stainless steel teeth because the Cheka had managed to knock all of his teeth out during interrogation. Yeah. Anyway, I'll be out of that.
Incredible stuff.
He did manage to kill more people than Hitler.
Now we're going to get you back, so you can, maybe if you want to have a little bit of rest before we...
All right, it's 5:30. Oh goodness, it's 10 minutes to 4.
Yeah, this has been working.
And you say I don't need to wear a suit tonight.
What you have is terrific. This is relaxed.
Actually, I've got 2 shirts. I can wear a shirt and tie. if you want.
Whatever you like, but it's relaxed. This is not
Okay, I'll go as I am.
This is not showtime. Tomorrow at 10:30, find a tie. that'll be it.
Okay, what do I do? Just submit a bill to you